Welcome to 2819. I'm Sandra Dimez.
And I'm Daniel Almaguer.
And today's topic is about the difference between human and Neanderthal souls. And we're going to be hearing specifically from Professor of English and Philosophy, Kyle Keltz.
Yes. In Everyday Apologetics, Kyle Keltz will offer answers to some common atheistic challenges.
And in Science Faith Connection, Jeff Zorink will also chat with Kyle on whether Neanderthals have human souls.
First up is going to be Culture Talk. Sandra will be interviewing Kyle on whether humans have souls or not. So let's check it out.
Welcome to Culture Talk, where we talk about culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. And I am joined today with Dr. Kyle Keltz. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you for having me.
You are a professor of English and philosophy at South Plains College, and we are going to be talking about kind of a fun question. How do we know that humans have souls? So I'm very excited to talk about this because we're talking about souls. It's a cool topic. So as we start to explore this topic of souls, some people might say, is it even rational to believe that humans have souls? So how do you respond to that?
There's several philosophical arguments for the existence of the soul, but one of my favorite is kind of almost the opposite of what you're saying. I would argue that it's actually irrational to believe that you don't have a soul. C.S. Lewis is famous for formulating an argument along these lines. We call it the argument from reason. He wrote about it in Miracles. And what he emphasizes is that rationality, right? When you say, well, I looked at the evidence and I believe this. What we assume in the rational process is that you are able to understand the evidence and that you make a decision. Do I believe this evidence warrants this decision or this decision? And so you make a conclusion on a rational basis. Now, if you don't have a soul, though, and you're completely physical, an issue with that is that if you are completely physical, then everything about you is going to be controlled by the laws of nature. So even that would include all the decisions that you've made. So if you don't think you have a soul, you say something like, I don't believe we have souls. Well, an issue with that is that you reach that conclusion for physical reasons, not for rational reasons. We think that only if you have this immaterial soul, this intellect and a will that's not subject to the laws of nature, are you able to have free will and able to reason to conclusions based on evidence.
Interesting. So when we talk about it being irrational to believe that we don't have a soul, then how do we jump to the next conclusion? Okay, we do have souls, and it is more rational to believe that we do have souls. How do we make a distinction between how humans behave and that sort of soulish behavior and how maybe some hominids behave, and if that is also soulish behavior or demonstrating that they have a soul?
Oh, yes. And this is one thing I love talking to my students about in our philosophy classes is the difference between humans and animals. And today we talk about the difference between humans and Neanderthals and hominids and stuff like that actually goes pretty far back in Western philosophy. The Greek philosopher Aristotle, in a work called On the Soul, De Anima, he argued that the main difference between humans and non-human animals is that humans are able to take in universal abstract concepts. And it's an interesting argument that philosophers still defend today called the storage problem argument. And it mainly revolves around how are human beings able to understand, to know, basically to store universal concepts. And when I say universal concepts, I mean things like justice or triangularity, or even like things like redness, And to explain it, one thing when I'm talking to my students about universals, when we talk about metaphysics, is I present an example of like a fire truck and an apple, right? And I say, okay, so this fire truck is red, this apple is red, but noting that physical things can't be in more than one place at one time, what would we say redness is, And everyone realizes, okay, well, redness itself can't be some physical thing. It can't be some particular. It's this universal abstract, immaterial concept. Well, now an issue is you can't store a universal in a physical thing, right? Because if you have this concept, this abstract form in some particular physical thing, then it just is that thing, right?
Right.
You know, when you look at a triangle, for example, you see a triangle, you don't see triangularity, but you abstract that concept of triangular from triangle. So anyway, long story short, the difference between animals and non-human animals is that we can take in these universals and we think that there has to be something immaterial about us to be able to store that, right? Because we know these concepts. It's not just information flowing through us that we don't have a grasp on. And that's not only shows us that we do have a soul, but it shows the main difference between us and animals, or us and Neanderthals, or something like that. We have this ability to take in universal abstract concepts, and you can use that ability to not only understand things, but also to apply meaning. So that's what makes language possible. That's what makes technology possible, art, religion, all these things that necessarily involve abstract thinking.
Right. So we're talking about then the distinction between animals and humans would be kind of that symbolic ability to use symbols and to have abstract thought, correct?
Yes, and theologically, maybe even more importantly, the idea that we have an immaterial soul, like I mentioned earlier, it makes it possible so we are moral. You know, we have a choice between our decisions, so there's one way we ought to act and one we ought not to act. But also we think that because the soul is immaterial, it is something that can survive the death of our bodies and make the afterlife possible. You know, a major difference between humans and animals is that we have souls and they don't, or they don't have souls like we do anyways.
Right. Well, there's a lot to talk about with this topic, and I know that you're going to be talking with Jeff a little bit later on diving more into the topic of Neanderthal behavior and how that's distinct from humans, particularly from the scientific discoveries of music and burials and such. But I do want to kind of wrap it up by asking, like, how do we have this conversation with others if you're trying to share your faith with someone? How do you use the topic of soul to do so?
Oh yeah, and I think it has great application with apologetics, but also mainly in evangelism. You know, if you're sharing your faith with someone, or just just friends with someone or whatever out in public, a lot of times when people are doing evangelism, they lead with the question, what do you think happens when we die? Now, in our culture, you might end up meeting a lot of people who are going to say, absolutely nothing. I don't think anything happens when we die because we're just physical. And I think that if you have a rudimentary grasp of some of these arguments for the existence of the soul, you can lead with that, and at the very least, put a rock in their shoe, have them thinking about, well, maybe there is more to me than just the material. Maybe I will survive the death of my body, and maybe that can lead to further conversations where you can, lead into the gospel and other things.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that again. It's a very deep topic, lots to unpack. If you want to hear more about this topic, go to reasons.org and search soul.
Is Christianity really true? Is the Bible really reliable? These are the types of questions that skeptics and atheists ask. And I'm joined today by Dr. Kyle Keltz, who is a Christian scholar, who is a philosopher of religion, who teaches English and philosophy at the collegiate level to help engage these questions. Now, Kyle, one of the atheists who raises these types of questions is a guy by the name of Dan Barker, who's a fairly well-known atheist. Some people say he's one of the most well-known atheists in the United States, an ex-preacher who I think is the co-founder for the Foundation for the Freedom from Religion or something like that, and travels around the U.S. and does debates and lectures challenging the Christian faith. And you and Tricia Scribner edited a book and then also contributed to a book called Answering the Music Man, which is essentially engaging some of Dan Barker's arguments against Christianity. Okay, so let's just maybe give a thumbnail for how you responded to each of those objections. So one of them, again, was, are faith and reason compatible? So what's Barker's complaint, and then kind of in a bottom line, how did you respond to that?
Okay. He defines faith as a belief in something even though you know it to be false, or a belief in spite of the evidence.
Right.
And what I did in that chapter was I just showed that that is not what Christianity teaches.
Right.
And you could actually find this out with a quick Google search, by the way. It just amazes me that he holds to this thesis. But I mean, in Christianity, for example, there are at least three mature, developed views of the relationship between faith and reason that you can see in the history of Christianity, dating all the way back to the 2nd century with like Tertullian and other church fathers, like 150 AD and that far back.
Yeah.
So it was just it's almost embarrassing to see him say that this is what faith is and this is why I reject it. So what I did is I just showed that there's all these views, and in the chapter I talk about Thomas Aquinas's view of faith and reason, a view called the synthesis of faith and reason view. So I explain the details of that in there and just show people what Christians actually believe about faith and reason.
Right. And so Christians have long held that our faith should be rational, should be reasonable.
Yes.
Right. If it is indeed true.
Yes. Yeah. And so going along with Aquinas, he defines faith as taking something on the basis of an authority. Mm-hmm. And, reasoning is learning about the world through all the ways that we do, whether it's philosophy or science or other means. And he argues for like three types of truths. He says there's truths of reason only. These are truths like the atomic weight of oxygen or the number of planets in the galaxy. Truths of faith and reason. These would be truths that the Bible talks about, but also you can discover through reason. So that'd be like God's existence or the existence of the soul or Jesus' resurrection. You can use philosophy, you can use history to confirm these things. Or then there's truths of faith only. These are things that he says, well, we can't use philosophical arguments to determine this. It would be like the Trinity or the hypostatic union. We can use reason to show that's not contradictory, but we can't use an argument to do that. So, but when you learn the philosophy and all the apologetics, it makes it so that you're not taking the truths of faith and reason on faith. You know those things, and then it strengthens your faith whenever you believe things like the Trinity and
right. So it sounds like Aquinas had a pretty sophisticated perspective on faith and reason and how we know things.
Yes, hundreds of years ago, and Dan Barker's presenting this like all Christians believe that faith is believing something you know to be false. Right. So it's just it's just sad, and we're just trying to clear up the misconceptions.
Yeah. So another chapter that you wrote is entitled "Are God's Attributes Incoherent and Incompatible?" So again, what's Dan Barker's complaint here, and then how did you engage his points?
I really thought that when Dan Barker, I think that when he talks about in Godless and his debates, when he starts talking about the attributes of God, it's this might be the most clearest time when he doesn't really understand what Christianity is teaching. So in his book, he makes many complaints about the attributes of God. He doesn't think that they make sense in and of themselves. And then he argues that it makes it even worse when you try to say that God is this and that at the same time. These things contradict each other. So, I mean, he makes many complaints that we don't really have time to cover all of them, but I can talk about what he says about omniscience and omnipotence, for example.
Sure.
So omniscience, God is all-knowing. An interesting thing he says is that if God is all-knowing, he needs to have like a picture or a concept of everything that exists in his mind. But that would mean that he would also need to have a picture, and he uses that word, a picture of himself in his mind. But then that picture would need to have a picture of him in it. You know, it's like saying that you have a map of the entire world, but if it's really accurate, that map would also need to have a map in it, and then that map would have a map. And he thinks that is like goes to infinity and is some kind of absurdity. So what I do in the chapter on that part is I just clear up, you know, what do we think omniscience is? Mm-hmm. And a classical understanding of omniscience is to just say that God knows all existing things. He knows, and he knows what he could make, anything that he could conceivably make. To say that God is all-knowing, I think, especially in this aspect, it just shows that he kind of has this misconception of who God is. Because God, and this isn't just wishful thinking, philosophers can reason to what God is like for certain reasons. Like in the Kalam, we say that if the universe had a beginning, all space and time and energy had a beginning, then the cause of the universe must be immaterial and be all powerful, and be all knowing, to be able to create all that. So, but the thing is, God is thought to be immaterial. So, if God does know himself, but that doesn't have to have some kind of image that has an image of it and an image of it. So it was just really bizarre to hear what he said about God's omniscience. And his idea of God's omnipotence, he says that power is inherently a physical thing. So right off the bat, he's creating problems for himself, because it's not wishful thinking that God is immaterial. It's a conclusion that we can reach from reason alone, not to mention that the Bible says that God is spirit. So he obviously has issues with God being omnipotent, because then he would need to be some kind of infinite physical force or something like that. So I just cleared up that that's not what Christianity teaches. To say that God is omnipotent means that he can create anything that's conceivable, So, and then he gets into how God's attributes contradict each other. A really quick example is an argument he makes, what he calls he has an acronym for it, the FANG argument. It's like the free will argument for the non-existence of God. And what he says is that God can't have free will and be all-knowing at the same time, because if he's all-knowing, that means that he knows everything he's going to do. But if he knows what he's going to do, then he doesn't have genuine choice. And I think he's just misunderstanding Christianity and making conclusions that no Christians have made before. To say that you know what someone is going to do doesn't necessarily mean they don't have a choice in it.
Thanks, Kyle. And if you want to learn more about some of the resources that Kyle has produced for us here at Reasons to Believe, go to our website, reasons.org, and search Kyle Keltz's name. And then also you will be able to find links to Kyle's website and to other resources that Kyle has developed as part of his own personal ministry. And again, would encourage you to look for a copy of this book called Answering the Music Man. A very good resource that's a great introduction to Christian apologetics and to Christian theology too, it sounds like. So thanks again, Kyle.
Hello, Jeff Zwarenk, and welcome to Science Faith Connection, the segment of our show where we explore important scientific and philosophical ideas and see how they relate to the truth of Christianity. Today we're joined by Dr. Kyle Keltz, and we're going to be discussing whether Neanderthals had souls. Kyle, good to have you on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
So give us a little bit of background. I know you've done some study on this. What all is your background, and why are you here today?
Oh, yes. Well, I have a PhD in philosophy of religion, and whenever I was doing my dissertation for the PhD, I studied the problem of animal suffering. And, it's the problem of reconciling animal death with God being all powerful, all good, and all knowing. And a lot of that study had to do with the difference between humans and animals, because we want to be clear on the difference between humans and animals, because we think that animal suffering is different from human suffering. So because of that study, I studied animal minds and animal cognition. And, we're going to be talking about Neanderthals today, and that has a lot of significance for that. So,
no, that does. That plays right in. So what is the evidence, or why do people talk about Neanderthals having souls? It seems like that's, why do we even ask that question?
Okay, well, yeah, that's a great question, because, when we study the natural history of the Earth and we find hominids like Neanderthals, scientists are, of course, like secular scientists, are looking for this link between modern humans, Homo sapiens, and our ancestors. So, because they're trying to find a link between humans and that universal common ancestor.
Right.
So they're looking for some link between us and apes or something like that. So when they study hominids and the behaviors that they were having, they're trying to see if this was just like one step down from us, or is there a gap between there? And so sometimes scientists are looking at the way Neanderthals are behaving, and they're trying to, some of them think that, no, maybe that's 2 steps ago, this wasn't like humans, and some of them are saying, no, we think that they're exhibiting human behaviors. So they probably were like humans.
Right.
And then when you get into a Christian context, we're asking, are they really like humans, and what does it mean to be a human?
So what behaviors did they find that give them lead them to draw the conclusion that they're kind of like humans or just a step removed from?
There's several types of behaviors that they're trying to attribute to Neanderthals and other hominids. Some of it is ornamentation. They think they were possibly wearing jewelry, burying the dead, art like cave art, and using fire and making tools are these main behaviors that they're trying to attribute to Neanderthals to try to show that they had this more symbolic capabilities like human beings do.
Because presumably the symbolic is one of the things that would distinguish us, or what we would argue distinguishes humans from all the animals. So if the animals are having symbolic behavior, that would make that connection tighter.
Yes, for sure.
So, how strong is this evidence for symbolic soulish behavior in Neanderthals and maybe even some of the other hominids?
Well, there's 2 main issues with the evidence. If the Neanderthals were here today, it would be a lot easier. We could just ask them, or just observe them and see if they had language, see if they had these more symbolic capabilities. But since they're not here today, all we have to go off of is the indirect evidence that we find in archaeology and in the natural history of the Earth. So we're looking at indirect evidence, and there's issues with what we find. Sometimes they're attributing advanced tool use to Neanderthals. Issues with that, it's hard to make a really hard conclusion that that's the only conclusion you can reach, that they were using these advanced tools. Because when you find a tool at some location, an issue is that Neanderthals lived alongside human beings at one point.
Yeah, it was like about 200,000 years to maybe 40,000 years ago.
Oh, yes.
For Neanderthals?
I think so.
Okay.
They're coming, what was it, like 350,000 years ago to 40,000 years ago. And we think human beings got here around 100, Homo sapiens sapiens, 150 to 100,000 years ago.
Right.
So there's some overlap there. If you find a tool at some location, it's an open question as to whether the Neanderthals were using that tool, or if it was dropped by a human being, or if they came along after the hominids left. So there's all sorts of issues with that.
Right.
Other things that have been attributed to them is like maybe they made instruments.
Okay.
For example, they found what they thought were bone flutes. At first, they saw these holes in these bones, and they thought, well, the Neanderthals must have been using these as flutes or musical instruments. But upon further study, they found they think it was more likely just to be animals coming across the bones and biting into it. So there's a lot of issues with determining and making hard conclusions as to what the evidence that we see really warrants.
Okay. So there's this question of, does the evidence actually point to that was Neanderthal behavior, or might it have been something else?
Yes.
So if it is Neanderthal behavior, how do we as Christians, does that cause problems for us, or how do we think about that?
I don't think so. So even if we really think that they were using tools, they had a little bit of art or jewelry or some of these other activities that would seem to indicate that they had symbolic thought. An issue is, this is why I don't think that Neanderthals exhibiting these behaviors would be problematic, is that whenever you do study animal cognition, we have found in the animal kingdom a lot of behaviors that are similar to the things being attributed to Neanderthals. So, one of my favorite examples is the bowerbird. It's a type of bird that builds this really intricate nest in their mating rituals.
Right.
And if you came across one of these nests, you might assume like some child or maybe some like skilled artist was there making these really intricate nests. But they not only make these nests on the ground that are really amazing as it stands, but also they decorate them.
Right. Okay.
They'll go find flowers or other objects that are certain colors, and not only do they bring them back to the nest, but they'll arrange them according to color and all sorts of different patterns. They'll chew up flowers and then spit that out to use as paint to paint their nests.
Okay.
I mean, it's just
Pretty elaborate behavior.
Yes, yes. In apes, we see that they understand, they can predict wildfires. They know what fire is, and they interact with it in certain ways. I mean, I was watching a video this morning on YouTube of an ape starting. It was taught this by a human, but it started a fire. It built a fire and then roasted some marshmallows.
Nice.
And
Okay.
there's all sorts of other animals that do similar behaviors.
Well, I know there's a fish that makes this very elaborate sand. So yeah, there is a lot of behavior as you're describing. So.
Yes, yes. So because no one's really arguing that these animals are self-aware or these animals are capable of these higher order symbolic activities, because the major thing that I think that leads to the conclusion that Neanderthals weren't like humans is because of advancements, a lack of advancement that we see.
Okay.
I think, like Homo heidelbergensis was around from like 900,000 years ago to 200,000 years ago, so it's around 700,000 years. Neanderthals are around, like we said, about 300,000 years.
Right.
But when you look at all the evidence we find, they had these rudimentary tools, but there's no evidence of an advancement of culture. There's no technological improvements. They just use the same old tools the whole 300,000 years.
Okay.
I mean, that's a little oversimplification, but that's basically what you see. There's no advancement.
So it sounds almost like an innate ability rather than a learned creative ability like we would see in humans.
Yes, because, when humans show up 100,000, 150,000 years ago, now today, we started from scratch. Now today we've got the atom bomb. We're sending rovers to Mars.
Right. Yeah.
We're creating works of art that depictions of things that we've never seen. All of, and we have language, of course, and technology. So all of this is proof that we have symbolic thought. Whenever you see hominids being around for hundreds of thousands of years with no advancement, it just leads to the conclusion that their activity is more explainable through innate behavior rather than creating culture and technology and things like that.
Well, thanks, Kyle. I really appreciate your comments. It is pretty fascinating when we look at Neanderthals and other hominids, the level of ability that they have. They build fires, they decorate their nests, they do other things like this. But yet when we look closely, what we find is that behavior seems to be more innate rather than flowing from a creative soul like in humanity. I'd encourage you to go to reasons.org. There's a great article that helps equip you with more information on how to think about whether Neanderthals have souls. It's called Were Neanderthals People Too? Check out that article because it'll help equip you to be able to be part of this important discussion and see how you can share Christ even in these difficult topics.
And that's all the time we have for 2019. We hope this episode has helped equip you to share your faith with compassion and confidence.
And we hope you learned a lot about the soul. We learned a lot about human behavior and Neanderthal behavior and the distinction.
Right. Yeah. It was really interesting to learn about how the way that they would use tools over like a very long period of time without being able to really adapt and advance their kind of like ancient technology.
Right, and the difference that like Neanderthals weren't creating culture in the same way that humans are. So definitely learned a lot about soul. We hope you learned a lot as well. And we hope that you will stay in touch with us by finding us on social media, first subscribing to the show, and then also finding us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are at 2819 Show.
And if you want the audio version of the show, you can find us on most major podcast services. Just search Reason Simply Podcast.
See you next week.
See ya.